Hello and welcome everybody to Organizing Upgrade. My name is Xiomara Corpeño and I am your host for today. Our guest today is Saúl Sarabia, a racial justice activist and organizer from Southern California. Before we start, I just want to remind everybody to make sure to like us on Facebook and YouTube so you can follow us. And we are going to get started. Saúl, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you on again. Today's topic for our audience is critical race theory and the attack on critical race theory right now that we're seeing in the news that is more than really about critical race theory. But first, we want to start, Saúl, we'd love for you to begin to tell us a little bit more about critical race theory. Where does it come from, and what are the main tenets of critical race theory?
Thank you, Xiomara. I appreciate being back on the show, and just want to thank all of you at Frontline for your labor. I think it's important to start with the question of what is critical race theory, since the topic that we're going to discuss today has really been built around creating a definition of critical race theory that could create a mass mobilization against the teaching of any kind of racial history in the United States. And in that, people have really actually passed over the question of what is CRT, and I think in the process, fallen victim of the strategy. And so I think it's important for me to just say where I'm coming from. I was a law student in the mid-1990s. I had the opportunity to take courses as a law student of various different traditions. The whole first year law school curriculum has theories that underlie how you're being taught certain concepts, or even just the basic idea that the law does not see color, that justice is blind, and that's why the statute has a blindfold. And critical race theory came on the scene in the late 80s to really challenge these fundamental assumptions about both legal education and the jurisprudence of judges when talking about racism, and adjudicating cases having to do with racial discrimination. And in that process, I really appreciated, as a learner, being exposed to competing theories of how we understand race, starting with in a critical race theory seminar where we were asked to read conservative theories of race, liberal theories of race, and of course the emerging writings in critical race theory. I think that's the core of a critical thinking skill development that we would want to see in any school. And so I want to just share that this is a very individualized, personal rendition that I think has helped me over the years have an appreciation for a very complex field. I think about critical race theory in three ways. First and foremost, as a queer man of color, subject to discrimination of different types in the United States, I find it fascinating to read about critical race theory as an intellectual movement, as an organizing strategy by people of color and white allies in regards to how law schools were teaching future lawyers and future legal academics about how to theorize and think about race. Some of those founders of the field were students when it was being created and rejected liberal theories of race, conservative legal theories, and also got into a collaboration and a contestation with leftist neo-Marxist conceptions of racial ideology and the role of race in maintaining oppression in the United States. And this was fascinating to me. I think that first and foremost, we have to name it for what it is. It was an actual activist intervention into how we understand race, and it revolutionized, whether you agree with it or not, it revolutionized the field. It revolutionized how academics think and write about race to give rise to the language of structural racism. And it completely challenged the legal field and in particular, the way the courts are stuck in an old model of looking at racial discrimination cases. The other dimension of critical race theory that I think is important to name is that it offered a framework for people that are doing racial justice organizing and social justice work in general, in terms of having a more rigorous approach and having an approach that might be able to withstand some of the pitfalls that have befallen social movements in the past, including the Black Civil Rights Movement, including the feminist movement, out of which some of the initial analysis came. And I think that the questions that were animating some of the young people at the time, who very much like the youngsters today, are saying something doesn't make sense about how we think about these problems.
So can you talk about some of the key concepts then of critical race theory? I feel like you've given us a little bit of background. Could we get into a little bit more of the concepts? Like what
Sure
makes
thing.
it different? Yeah.
I think it's appropriate to start with the most popularized concept that is also having its sort of 15 minutes of fame, and even if it's in distorted fashion often. But I think over the last 5 years, maybe 10, but certainly the last 5, and during the Trump administration, the concept of intersectionality, which was coined in one of the foundational pieces of the critical race canon by Kimberly Crenshaw, who also coined the term critical race theory, is one that particularly in movement spaces has sort of circulated and served as a framework for folks that are basically saying something about the approach for how we fight for justice isn't expansive enough. Other people might say it isn't radical enough. Others might just say it isn't effective because we had the civil rights movement, and then we have the problem of mass incarceration. We had the women's rights movement, and yet we are looking at a Supreme Court that could invalidate Roe versus Wade. So what are ways to think about oppression that might more fully account for how it really works in the world and can inform our strategies? And so I think intersectionality is probably one of the most well-known concepts, and it was as much a critique of how judges adjudicated claims by people that were suffering multiple forms of discrimination, as it was a critique of movements and a call for movements to do their work from a more rigorous place, and a place that was more rooted in a more expansive definition of justice. So I think that is one of the most important contributions. And I also would say that on the other extreme, one of the things that's interesting to watch about how critical race theory is being debated now is that some of the, in my opinion, least well-known concepts come out of the school of racial realism that the founder of critical race theory, Derek Bell, advanced in some of his early writings. And those writings included concepts such as the concept of the permanence of racism, or what he called racial realism. The racial realist line of thinking essentially says there's no evidence. If we look at Black life expectancy, if we look at Black wealth, if we look at Black incarceration rates, if we look at well-being, whatever metric in any part of American history, to show that this problem actually can go away. And so he was challenging people doing social justice work to consider whether or not the racial idealism that underlies fighting for equality, what he called the equality principle, actually might be contributing to racial oppression. And this was a radical idea, even in its time. He also.
Can I just say, like, what brings up for me is that that guy that goes part and parcel with the conversation about that critical race theory basically says that racism is baked into what the United States is, from the founding of it all the way to now. And so the whole thing, my understanding is the whole thing is poisoned. And so we cannot have a conversation about racial justice in the framework of the US law. Is that an oversimplification?
I think what the nuance that I think would help is to address sort of where the current attack takes that, right? So to say that structural racism exists or that racism was baked in to the actual laws and policies that created and continue to govern most of life in the country is not the same thing as to say that it isn't amenable to social action, right? I don't think any critical race theorist would say that the reality of being of having the enslavement of an African American, of a Native person, which happened in this land that we're in, that is somehow equivalent to the types of racial oppression that we experience now, and that critical race theorists, including Derek Bell, wouldn't call for folks to struggle politically to change the material conditions of the lives of people subject to racism. At the same time, to answer your question, then the answer is yes. Critical race theory created a method to interrogate how, primarily looking at the language of legal decisions themselves and at the terms of how laws get debated, how much of the racial animus or the sort of continuing seduction of white over colored supremacy undergirds so much of our legal system. To say that that is controversial in a country where the founding constitution says blacks are 3/5 of a human being, or in modern day where voting rights laws are being literally written in a race neutral way, specifically to disenfranchise voters, like taking out every possible polling place in a black county, seems uncontroversial, but this is what the right has managed to do in this time.
I've heard you say it in some of the readings that I did preparing for today. So it's like racial injustice in this country is not an aberration. It's actually the norm, right? Is that sort of?
Yeah, and so
I want to just remind our viewers today, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. We look forward to answering any of your questions, if you have any, throughout the interview. So go ahead, Saúl, finish your thought.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we were to list out some of the founding principles, if you're a racial justice organizer, as you are, it might not seem like that much of a novelty, right? So, but to really think about it from the perspective of, folks who are reading legal cases, the assumption of the courts is when racism happens, when racial discrimination happens, it is a deviation from the norm. And you, the plaintiff, have to prove a smoking gun to show that something was being done to affect you, because the world is otherwise now fair because we had the civil rights movement. So yes, the proposition that racism is endemic rather than aberrational, that it is systemic rather than just individualized or a function of bias, were considered novelties and were actually considered radical propositions when the critical race scholars were challenging the way that these things were being taught to future lawyers.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to shift a little bit, or we can come back a little bit to the theory, but I want to shift to what the debate is now. So we all know that the Trump administration and the whole Trump movement, right, has been this resurgence of white supremacy and the white nationalist movement. And then in September of last year, in the midst of another uprising around race in this country, and after George Floyd's murder. So in September of last year, we saw the Trump administration move to really take out any conversations of race within, the different government departments, stomping out all conversations about any type of white male privilege. And now what we're seeing, even after he's now gone from office, these folks have doubled down and they're going after educational curriculum, universities and K through 12. And we know that, elementary school, they're not learning critical race theory. So in your summation, what is this fight really about?
I think it is important to think about the mobilization under the banner of stopping CRT for what it is. It is not new in the sense that it is a stand-in for Obamacare when the right wing wanted to mobilize a base of people to object to the election of the first Black president. And we saw the Tea Party form, and we saw the grassroots mobilization that was not just a call to white people, but people who submit to a subjectivity of white supremacy in the United States, and who were able to do that, who were able to be marshaled around, in part, the idea that Barack Obama, a Black man, was not really American. And we've seen similar attempts to mobilize white rage and to make a call to action to sort of exert white racial power in various different contexts, even in the current time period preceding CRT. Here in California, when Trump made sanctuary laws a target and also attempted to use that as a sort of political mobilizing concept or reason, we saw in city council meetings people that were emboldened to literally come in and in some cases exert physical violence on folks that were testifying at their city council saying, we actually want the sanctuary law. And the sort of Trump right-wing mobilized constituency was there to say, no, we want you to sign on to the lawsuit against California's sanctuary law. And so I think naming it for what it is, which is basically a call to civic action in the most bare ways, back to the white citizens councils, and that it's multiracial, that there are people that have adopted this subjectivity shouldn't change nor confuse that. The fact that parents are being used and the fact that children are being used in this way at the local level should also take us back to the Red Scare and to take us back to moments where, right, there's this bogeyman of communism, and that's what, you know, the authors, the intellectual authors of this current movement have explicitly said they were trying to do, namely Christopher Rufo from the Manhattan Institute.
Right. What's crazy to me is that, you know, these folks on the right and these nationalists are basically saying, like, you're making everything about race. When everything they say about race is I was listening to another, you know, just doing some reading and watching of some other interviews. And it's just like, you know, like they're saying, oh, you know, it's like they don't want to theorize or put these ideas of racism or even make white kids ashamed of who they are. But they have no problem in attacking the intelligence of people of color, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. They have no problem doing that constantly. You know, when we talk about the illegal immigrant or, you know, the welfare, all of these things, they have no problem. And that's their racial theory, right? Is that naturally we are inferior and that's why they can subjugate us. But here they are making an argument that we're not allowed to talk about race.
I mean, Xiomara, I think you're hitting the nail on the head around what should be the relative comparison. So not only at the level you're talking about, which is conceptually, right, and the ideological, you know, the CRT of conservative race theory is either biological inferiority, which underlines statements such as shithole countries and why should our immigration laws not reflect that they're, you know, Trump said it, why can't we bring in people from Norway, right? Instead of Haiti, things like this, to your point. But then, you know, in every other way, we also have a resurgence of an actual ideology of white nationalists saying we cannot live in the same country, people taking arms in places like Idaho and Michigan, the militia movement. And so the very fact that we're having to be put on the defensive around the idea that teaching children critical thinking skills about race in a moment where they're seeing race being deployed in various different ways, whether it's the actual uprising against systemic racism post George Floyd, or everything that's happened since Timothy McVeigh to consolidate former veterans, military people, law enforcement folks, and other people that just fell into the trap of white supremacist thinking is a little bit unbelievable. But then again, it's not if we think about the other problems that are happening where there's an attack on facts There's the gaslighting that's happening around, like, you're doing this thing that they're actually doing, right? Around
Right.
attacking these very principles.
Right. I'd love to shift to think about just, what are the ways that this is actually like bread and butter actually impacting people? Because a lot of people, there's a lot of pontificating like culture war and throwing out these buzzwords and people talking about critical race theory, but we're not talking about, well, actually, what is the thing that's happening? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how are we actually seeing this play out?
Yeah, no, and I think it also needs to be talked about at a few different levels. I think that there are very real threats to actual human beings and communities, particularly in purple and red states, who are taking the risk of saying the government can't tell us what to read. That's ironic again, right? Because this is coming out of a libertarian think tank. It's coming out of a conservative movement that claims to own this sort of don't tread on me, the government is your enemy. And yet they've passed laws now in more than 20 states where they've signaled to the most destructive elements that they should go to school board members, they should attack teachers, they should go into the schoolhouse and essentially bring the tiki torches. And I think that we have a duty to think about folks in spaces like that and the kind of way that we might want to stand up for them. I know we recently learned about the movement that is being led by Black Lives Matters in schools to circulate a petition to have teachers in all these spaces say, I will teach the truth and I will risk civil disobedience. Well, when we've done that in the past, we've wanted to protect people from the worst kinds of harms. Another thing where it's playing out is in the censorship, the self-censorship in other places that may not ever even be close to being attacked in this very real way, in this very violent way, but nevertheless to avoid issues, right? To not put yourself in front of that kind of potential violence, then you simply modulate, and maybe you won't actually talk about slavery. You won't talk about the way that discrimination is playing out today. And then ultimately, I think as activists, it's important to be very specific that this is a specific attempt to tamp down on the mass uprising against systemic racism that started after George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin. And this is an attempt also to create a counter narrative and a counter movement to the most widespread social movement of our time, which is Black Lives Matter, not only in the United States, but globally. And so I think we have to keep working at all those levels, but I would name those areas around where it's playing out. I'm unable to hear you.
Oh, it's just my mic was muted. I think it also just speaks to just like there is this right-wing nationalist movement and it's white supremacists, and they want to keep the truth from us. I was listening to Bill Fletcher Jr. He's a regular contributor to Organizing Upgrade and Frontline Dispatches, and he said, we have to keep fighting for the truth, right? Because they want to keep selling us an alternative history. Even as just 6 months ago, January 6th, what happened on the Capitol, they already want to lie about it, and then they want to lie about the entire history of this country. And I think it's disgusting, and it's also very scary in how they're doing it.
Yes, and I would like to say that it would be a mistake not to locate this as another front in the attack on science, and the attack on facts. Because of course, if we say it's an attack on truth, they are just going to say, well, that's not my truth, right? Mm-hmm. But we have this very subtle attack on, an election happened, the way in which we measure whether or not there was tampering in elections. We have institutions that are set up to do that. Even under Trump's administration, his own attorney general said there is no evidence of any kind of mass fraud. And yet a large chunk of the people in this country believe that the sitting president was put in through a fake election. So this is absolutely part of that distortion, to say anything that is about race or racism is A, critical race theory, and B, toxic and dangerous. That is part of this entire manufacturing of alternative realities that is part of a fascist current drive in the country. I will say that there's probably critical race scholars who wouldn't go as far as to say that the democratic institutions are under attack, which were working, right? That there's a way for us to name the rise of that sort of neo-fascist attack on facts without also having to endorse that what was coming out of the Capitol building and the relationships of people who are in the Capitol building in relation to folks of color was all okay, right? And it's necessarily our job to defend that. But there is something that's very specific around pushing back to the advent of a more pluralistic, multiracial democracy, which is basically the experiment that everyone refers to in this country. So I would just make that distinction.
Saúl, we have a couple more minutes, but I do want to address that. There is a debate on the left where there is a critique of critical race theory. One, it's saying that it's pessimistic, into saying that, like even disputing the 1619 Project and saying like, hey, this is where like racism, at least in this piece around anti-Blackness and white supremacy, was born. And so I have heard left activists, people that I know and love and trust, but who say like, oh, CRT is just, it's a dead thing. We shouldn't even be fighting for that. And what would be your response to that?
Well, I do think that it's important to acknowledge, again, we're talking about an exercise in critical thinking. And if something is that, then you're not going to end up with a question of who's right or who's wrong. The invitation is to think more rigorously about something. And in this case, you're right. When CRT arose, it arose as a contestation against mainstream liberal ideology that suggested that the country slowly progresses towards the promised land of racial equality, and showing where there was structural determinism and permanence of these fundamental ideas that shape the nation. And it was also a contestation and a challenge to critical legal scholars who are left thinkers, who had essentially taken the position that, I don't want to be too reductive, but the civil rights movement and movements like that simply are delaying the revolution. The real problem in the United States is class domination. And so to build an entire theory around race is sort of creating a mirage for folks. And so critical race theories arises out of people's lived experience, who says something about all of these explanations does not actually reflect how we've survived white supremacy. And this needs to be thought about in a different way, in a more rigorous way. And so I would just say, I would invite us to double down. What ended up happening when Harvard lost its only Black faculty member, and the students said, we refuse to take a course from folks that are not teaching about racism and the law, is they created an alternative course. They invited scholars who were teaching about these things to teach them in the courtyard and refused to enroll in the regular class. And that's what I think are called to do right now, which is if you're really engaged in producing critical thinking on whatever issue it is, democracy, race, class domination, then what we have to do is embrace the idea of thinking hard about what are these writings about, what is this scholarship about, and then articulate where something resonates and where something also needs further research, or you just don't agree with and want to theorize something else. If we can't be committed to that, then the other side has won.
Right. Thank you so much, Saúl. I appreciate it. I mean, what I'm coming out of this, whether, when you're on the left, whether you agree with CRT or want to think about a different way, we still have to talk about and contend with race in this country. And we have to make sure that we can continue to do that. debate it. And we have to fight this fight. So thank you so much, Saúl. As always, we love having you as a guest. I want to thank our viewers for today. Please make sure to tune in next week. We have Hamid Khan from the Stop LA Spying Coalition will be on with Gerald Lenoir. And we hope to see you next week at 4 p.m. Pacific. That's 6 p.m. Central and 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday on Facebook and YouTube. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Xiomara.
Thanks, Saúl. Just sit tight with me.